Matt Whitaker, thank you so much for being here with us today. How are you?
I'm doing great, Trey. Thank you. I'm honored to be on your program.
Well, it's exciting to have you here. You're the director of the new movie, Truth and Treason. It's a great film telling the story, the harrowing story of Helmuth Hübener. He was the youngest person executed for speaking out against Hitler's National Socialism. And, depicting Nazi Germany, Matt, has been something that has been in the cinemas so many times. But Helmut's story is a unique one and one that I had not heard before. So tell us a little bit about him and what drew you to his account.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree that we see a lot of World War II stories. My dad was a bomber pilot in World War II. I've been fascinated with that really crucial period in history for my entire life. Seen a lot of the movies. When I found this story about Helmuth Hübener, it really did feel strikingly unique to me. Here's a 16-year-old kid in Nazi Germany, raised surrounded by propaganda, raised not having access to the truth until his older brother, was a German soldier in Hitler's army, sneaks home an illegal shortwave radio. And Helmut, who was curious, tunes in to the BBC broadcasts. The BBC was broadcasting in the German language at that time during the war. And for the first time in his life as a 16-year-old, he's hearing the truth and immediately recognizes it and then takes that next step to do something about it, to take a stand. And so he picks up the only weapon he knows how to use, which is a typewriter. He was a brilliant young writer, very literate. And he starts typing these anti-Hitler, anti-Nazi leaflets. And at first, just by himself, starts going out on the streets of Hamburg at night, putting them out. He was typing them up on these little red pieces of paper that he got from his work, because he worked for the Nazis at City Hall in Hamburg in 1941. At first, just putting these things out by himself, typing at the bottom of them, "This is a chain letter, pass it on." He had this hope that people would read it, recognize the truth, pass it to somebody else. And then he starts recruiting his friends. He had two teenage friends. They were all part of the same Christian congregation there. And he recruited them, Karl-Heinz Schnibe and Rudi Woba. And these three teenage boys are putting out anti-Hitler, anti-Nazi leaflets throughout Hamburg, Germany. I had the incredible privilege of meeting one of those, the last surviving member of that group, Karl-Heinz Schnibe, Karl. Mm-hmm. He was in his late 70s. He shared his story with me, changed my life. I said, I have to share this story with the world. And it's been a journey since that point trying to do that.
In watching the movie, it kind of feels, it's dystopian, of course, but it also feels like you're almost stepping into the Twilight Zone when you see a kid who it's contraband for him to have access to information, for him to listen to the BBC, a news outlet that we still read today, for him to be looking at that or listening to that rather was, an act of treason, as you depict in the movie. So talk about that and the importance of a free press and why that is so critical to get access to information, because without that, he might not have ever learned the truth.
That's exactly right. And so it was on September 1st, 1939, the day that the Nazis, that Germany invaded Poland, that they also passed a decree that said anybody listening to illegal foreign broadcasts, it was a capital offense. You could be sentenced to death for doing that. And so when he got access to that, and also an interesting part that I was fascinated with is because he worked for the Nazis at City Hall, he had access to, they had an archive behind a locked door of banned books. So books that had been banned and of course burned, famously or infamously burned, but they'd kept copies of those in certain places throughout Nazi Germany. And one of those was in the City Hall where he worked. And so he had access to these, and he was curious and was borrowing these books and gaining information, from those as well. And so he was in a unique position, having, access to the BBC broadcasts, having access to this banned literature. And then one thing happened, it was almost kind of like a perfect storm. He had a Jewish friend, a young Jewish man named Solomon Schwartz, who had converted to Christianity and attended his faith community there. And then one day on the door of that church, there was a sign that said, "Jews not allowed to enter." And that was, just a horrible thing. And for Helmuth, seeing what happened to his Jewish friend there, and then shortly thereafter that, his friend Salomon was taken by the Nazis and ended up in a concentration camp. And for Helmuth, it was this clear point of demarcation. It was this point of, I can't just watch it happen anymore. I know the truth. I have to say something about it. And so that for me was just such an example. To your point, the freedom of the press had been completely clamped down. I think it's hard for us to really understand that today.
Yeah.
Although we can see efforts, we can see things both in other countries and in our country where, there are efforts to silence those who are speaking out peacefully, but speaking the truth.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm certainly not wanting to, in this next question, draw a comparison between the United States and what we're dealing with now and what was the reality for people like Helmuth and, of course, for the Jewish people in Nazi Germany. But I do think that we are living in a dangerous time when free speech, as you alluded to, is increasingly under attack. I mean, Charlie Kirk, just a little more than a month ago, was assassinated because of the moral stand that he took on issues that he cared about. And we're increasingly hearing from people, truthfully, on both sides of the aisle who want to crack down on free speech of the other. So can you speak to that and the importance of not going down that road?
Yeah. You mentioned Charlie Kirk. That happened 5 minutes from my home. My nephew was third in line at the microphone when it happened. Just this incredible tragedy of a man, to your point, who was trying to speak to the truth. And to be completely candid, there were many things that he said that I wholeheartedly embraced. There were also things that he said that I did not agree with, but he was doing it peacefully. I think that was Helmuth's example, is that Helmuth didn't know how to use a gun. He had no interest in that. His mode of standing up was the typewriter, and the Gestapo knew that the typewriter was more dangerous than the pistol. They understood that, and so the power of the spoken and written word, I think, is something that we cannot undervalue. And I see it, like you say, Charlie Kirk was an example of that. In a different way, Jimmy Kimmel recently, somebody else who was trying to be silenced, and that's just one example. But to your point, it's not a Republican Democrat thing. I think that this is a story and an issue that transcends party politics. We need to understand that there needs to be a freedom of speech, that people need to be able to share their views. Of course, there is an importance of being honest and truthful in those. And I know that this is a very, very complex issue. There are, fake news is a real thing on both sides of the spectrum and everywhere in between. I've been somebody asked me the other day, I was like, well, how do you know what's truth? How do you know if with everything that's kind of so twisted these days? And I frankly I don't think there's an easy answer to that. Here's a way that I've been able to kind of articulate it for myself is the way Helmuth was raised, always just in propaganda. I think it was as if somebody was raised perhaps only having access to MSNBC or to Fox News, these things that are so leaning to one side or the other. And that's all they had access to. And then one day they turn on the radio and they hear Walter Cronkite and they hear objective news, objective truth, or as close as I think as we could come to it for the first time, and just recognizing this feels and sounds true to me. And I think that's what Helmuth experienced. And I think he was an example of what it means to stand up for freedom of the press, for the truth, but to do it peacefully.
Yeah. I don't want to give away too much of the film and Helmuth's story for people who are going to go see it in theaters. But there were, the couple of scenes that really, I think, struck me the most were when he was interacting either with the Gestapo or he's interacting with legal representatives who were, of course, carrying out the orders of the Third Reich. And you could see the biggest threat to them was the words he was speaking or the words that he wrote. And you mentioned, and it's throughout the film kind of a steady drumbeat, that the power of words is stronger than the power of a pistol. So talk about that and the just that back and forth and that tug and pull, I think, that we see throughout the movie between people saying, I think he should have the right to say this. But they don't. I don't know. But you can still see that they're warring with that in their minds. Like, he should be able to say this, but I know I have to carry out the orders of the Third Reich and of Hitler.
Yes, I'll tell you, as I delved into this true story, one of the aspects of it that was most fascinating to me was the Gestapo agent, whose name was Erwin Mussner. He was a real person. We found incredible detail about what this man was like, who, as is depicted in the film, did horrible things to people during the day, would torture people for information. And then he would go home at night, and he was a husband and a father. He was a loving
Yeah,
and kind person. I know that's hard for us to get our heads around, but that was the reality of it. And that was the reality of this person. And to your point, he was finding these little red leaflets throughout the streets of Hamburg, reading them, and also recognizing the truth. He knew, because he was in the Gestapo, he had access to more of the actual information than most Germans did, recognized that truth. Helmut's words were getting to him. He, in his own life, was dealing with the realities of life in Nazi Germany. And these words were getting into his psyche, and we have evidence of that. And then once, and again, no spoiler here, but once Helmut was caught, once he found out who was putting out these leaflets, first of all, he was stunned that it was a 16-year-old. They were convinced, the Gestapo was just convinced that it was a university professor, or something like that. Somebody, because they were so incredibly well written, but also so filled with the truth, that they were convinced of that. And frankly, when he caught him, they tortured him for days to try and get this 16-year-old to tell him, who's the adult behind this, who's writing these, who are you working for? And he kept saying, it's me, I'm the only one doing this, until they finally believed him. And then, of course, they tortured him to tell who was helping him. And he
yeah,
lasted for about 5 days before they broke him. And he gave the names of Carl and Rudy. And then Carl, who became a dear friend of mine, and Rudy Voba were arrested. Rudy having just turned 16, Carl having just turned 18, and were arrested. And all three of them go to the highest court in Nazi Germany. These three teenage boys, the highest court in Nazi Germany, before a Hitler-appointed judge. And then that's where Helmut just becomes, for me, just such an inspiring thing, as he stands up to this Hitler-appointed judge. And again, with the power of the word, gets in the face of this judge and exposes his lies. I feel like it's almost like a Pauline moment, if you will. I think of the Apostle Paul, who stood up before a kangaroo court, if you will, and was questioned and everything, and spoke the truth. Not to make too great of a reference, I greatly admire the Apostle Paul and what he did, but I see it when I see this 16-year-old kid in that high Nazi court standing up, speaking truth to power. I'm just really inspired by that.
Yeah, and something else that kind of struck me throughout the film is a saying that kept ringing in my head was, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think, how can well-intentioned desires, like many Germans who are misguided into supporting Hitler, how can that so quickly go awry?
It is interesting. When I sat down with Karl-Heinz Schnibbe, the last surviving member of this group, he talked to me about that, because I asked him that same question.
Yeah,
And he said, they only had access to certain information. There really was. It was just propaganda was all they were getting. But of course, eventually people started seeing things. They saw the way that their Jewish friends were being treated. They saw the way that people who didn't toe the line, the Nazi party line, were being treated and disappearing. But he said by then it was too late. And what he meant by that was a person could decide to speak out and speak the truth, but there was a term in Nazi Germany, it's a German word called Sippenhaft. And what it means is, if we arrest you, we're going to arrest your whole family. We're going to arrest people everybody's in danger. And so people were afraid at a certain point. By that time, things had really clamped down. And, especially after the war started in 39, and by 41, most people were afraid to do that, which makes Helmut's decision to stand up and do something about it both so incredibly courageous, but also very nuanced, because he did put his friends and his family in real danger doing
Yeah.
it. It's easy to look back, I think, at Nazi Germany 80 whatever years later and kind of see it in black and white. And I do believe, of course, there were evil Gestapo and evil Nazis and heroic, resistance fighters, but there was this gray area in the middle where most
Yeah.
Germans lived out their lives and were making decisions, and it was not easy. And so we see people, we see his bishop at church, who's and I met three of his sons. This was a real person. I met his three sons and met people who knew him and said what a wonderful, faithful Christian man he was, and yet he supported Hitler. He had bought into that, as so many people had. And somehow Helmut, this teenager, was able to see through that and see that, you know what, that's wrong. I love this man. I love my bishop, but that's wrong. And I have to find a way to do something about it.
Yeah. I think Helmut's story and the bravery that he exemplified is a good living example of the principle in 1 Peter 3:17. It says it's better to suffer for doing good, if that's what God wants, than to suffer for doing wrong. So talk about how learning more and diving into his story really impacted you, especially at a time when Charlie Kirk was assassinated. The movie is coming out not long after his assassination. You even said your nephew was there at that event. So how are these two stories kind of colliding in your life? How are they impacting you?
It's a great question, and since I discovered this story 24 years ago now, and dived deeper and deeper into it, I've been asking myself a question, and it's, what would I have done? And to be honest, I don't know. I doubt that I would have been as courageous as Helmut was. Just knowing myself, knowing that I've got a wife and kids, I don't know that I would have done that. But I do ask a follow-up question, and that is, what will I do now? How can I stand up for truth? How can I stand up for what is right? And to your point, from that beautiful scripture was it First Peter?
Yeah, First Peter.
That we're gonna be persecuted. I think we're gonna run into persecution in our lives, whether we stand up for truth or not. And so I guess I'd rather, the best part of me hopes that I will stand up for truth. And if I'm persecuted, if I'm ridiculed for that, so be it. Gratefully, I don't live in Nazi Germany. Me standing up for truth doesn't look like it did for Helmut and his friends, but it may be, if I see someone who's being treated unfairly, if I see someone who is seen as lesser of a human, if I see someone who is cast out, to stand up for them and not just say, I wish they wouldn't do that. If I see the stranger, what is referred to in the Old Testament as the stranger, who's not welcome in my home or in my community or in my country, can I stand up to that? And so I'm trying to be someone who can speak out for the person who is being cast out. I'm not perfect at it. I don't think any of us are, but because of Helmut's example, I think I'm maybe a little bit better than I would have been, and maybe a little bit better than I used to be.
As we're kind of rounding out the conversation, I want to say too, Matt, that storytelling and narrative and certainly films, they can communicate moral truths in a way that other mediums can't. I think people kind of put their guard down and they're willing to sit down and watch a 2-hour movie, but they might not be willing to sit down and listen to a 2-hour monologue or a debate or, something that feels more divisive. I think movies have a way of drawing us in. So for people who go and see the movie, what do you hope viewers walk away thinking about?
I've never seen this I've never wanted this to be a message film. It's an incredible true story. I want people to come away having been moved, having had a cathartic, inspiring experience. But as I mentioned, if people could walk out asking themselves those two questions, what would I have done and what will I do now? I think that would be a good thing. I hope that maybe, look, again, full disclosure, I'm aware that this is a movie. It's a piece of entertainment, But every once in a while, a movie comes out that leaves a mark, that makes a difference, that
Yeah.
connects with the zeitgeist, that makes people say, maybe I'm going to make different decisions in my life because of that inspiring story that I just witnessed. I believe in the power of story. I believe especially true stories, and so I hope that maybe this film can make just a little dent in helping people to understand the truth, or the importance of standing up for what is true, and maybe that can, to Helmuth's point, his final words to his two friends were, "Remember me." And I hope that maybe this is an effort to help people not only remember Helmut, but to remember all those who have taken a stand for truth. And I would say even and especially to remember Jesus, who was and is the ultimate source of truth. And if this film can have a little impact in that, I would be grateful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the movie is Truth and Treason. It's in theaters now. Matt Whitaker, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Trey. Again, it's been an honor.